Senator Murphy, the book is called The Violence Inside Us, A Brief History of an Ongoing American Tragedy. I spent the weekend reading it, and I don't even regret it because it's a great book.
I'm glad. Like the one emotion I don't want people to feel is regret when they read the book. Malaise is fine. Regret we don't want.
No, congratulations. And, I've read many a gun violence book, and yours is at the very top of that list. But let's start, I guess, with the title, The Violence Inside Us. One of the more fascinating pieces of your book really talked about the biology that makes human beings violent, and how over the course of many years, we were able to civilize ourselves and bring some of those biological impulses in check. Talk about that, because I feel like some of those biological indicators and how we were able to overcome that, a lot of that is really lost when we think about violence in today's America.
Well, first of all, Igor, great to be with you. Thanks for the conversation today. And obviously, I'm just a tremendous fan of the amazing work that you've done, and grateful for our partnership. Obviously the title is purposeful because, I want people to, understand that the entire sort of course of human history has been one very long exercise in trying to overcome this predilection towards violence that lies inside human beings. It's really interesting. If you compare the human species to other mammals, we are wildly more violent. We are today, and we always have been. And there's probably lots of reasons for that. But what you see over time is a species that finds ways to protect itself and its loved ones and advance itself economically and socially through other means than violence. And that is, a story that really takes us over the course of thousands of years. As we develop economies, we sort of figure out ways to get what we need for sustenance without attacking other groups of humans. As we develop the printing press, we start learning about people who are different than us, and it grows empathy such that we are a little bit less interested in conducting acts of violence. And so you see this big downward trajectory of violence in the human race. And it just is a sort of twofold reminder. One, that this sort of biological instinct towards violence is real. It's inside us. You have to recognize it, right? But that we should feel optimistic about our ability to do better, because that's frankly the story of human history over thousands of years, is a species becoming less and less violent, but only through action, right? It didn't happen naturally. This wasn't, just biology that changed inside us. Maybe that's a little bit of it, but mostly it's that we created rules, we created norms that all of a sudden gradually over time, just resulted in less human on human violence. And just a reminder that if we keep at it, we can overcome this sort of very unique phenomenon in the United States of high levels of violence compared to other high income countries. It's just that our norms and our rules are worse than other nations, and we can do better.
So one of the questions you try to answer is why America is more violent compared to other high-income nations. And you look at our very fabric, which is one of a melting pot, bringing together different folks from all around the world. I'm an immigrant from the Soviet Union, and so I'm very much a beneficiary of that kind of American spirit. But take us through some of the history, and you do this so skillfully in the book, showing how different waves of immigration created different kinds of tensions that then sometimes resulted in violence.
So let's go back to the story of the biology of violence, because I think you need to understand that the biology of violence is very much rooted in our need to protect our family and our tribe and our group, right? So whether we like it or not, inside of us is this trigger by which we often view individuals who we perceive to be of a different group as a threat. And there's lots of sort of science to show that sits inside of us. And that was necessary thousands of years ago when other groups and other tribes were literally threats to us. And so when you sort of encountered someone, you needed the sort of hormone level in your body to raise quickly in order to be ready for a fight. Of course, we don't need that any longer, but it still sits inside of us. And so I obviously am a proponent of changing America's gun laws, and the book makes the case that our gun laws are a big reason why we are more violent. But this nation, I think, has been uniquely set up for higher levels of violence, separate and aside from the number of guns we have, for two reasons. One, our history of using violence as a means of racial subjugation. I think that's definitely a piece of the story. But also, as you mentioned, because we are a melting pot, because, from close to the very beginning, we were a country unlike any other in the world, where we put together groups of people who were of different tribes and of different groups, different religions, different races. And we decided to all coexist. But by sort of biological nature, that often meant that we put people sort of in conflict with each other. And so what you see is that during these moments of spikes in migration to the United States, you see spikes in violence. So you have this big spike that happens in the 1840s and 1850s, not coincidental. That's the first big push of immigration from sort of Europe. And then you have another big spike in the early 1900s, again, not coincidentally, bam, right at that second big wave of migration. So it's part of our story. And it's unavoidable, but again, something that, we've shown the ability to overcome, because those spikes don't last. As people sort of learn to live with each other, they learn to fear each other less, the violence abates.
I immigrated in 1993, and shortly thereafter, you saw a decrease in violence. So I broke that pattern.
Exactly. It was you we didn't have to worry about.
Me and the Brady Law, right? Let me ask you about Sam Colt. It was one of the most, my favorite part of the book. Me learning that your Senate office is in the old Sam Colt factory, where I'm assuming it still is. But also just the rise of this man, the way he revolutionized firearms. And I think most interestingly to me, the way he was able to market those firearms, wrap them in this romanticized notion of what they are, what they mean to America, what they mean to, I think, masculinity broadly. And it's, of course, a pattern that firearm manufacturers continue to this very day. And so I would just love to hear that piece of history from you again.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating story, and one that's very personal to me. As you mentioned, our office in my congressional office in Hartford is in the building where Colt manufactured all his firearms. I also live a stone's throw from that factory on a street where lots of Colt's employees and executives lived, and my running route is right by Samuel Colt's old house. So, Samuel Colt is one of a handful of these mid 19th century firearms inventors that creates the modern firearms industry. He invented the repeating revolver. He was, I think, a teenager who had been sort of sent away by his father because of his continued bad behavior. And while he was working on a ship bound for India, he invented this idea of a repeating revolver that could reload automatically, came back and started producing it, and very quickly found markets for it. But this was also during a period of westward expansion, again, in the middle 1800s. And, these stories of Americans and pioneers fighting against the savage Native Americans were captivating the country at this point. And Colt figured out that he could market his weapon as inside these stories of American expansionism and cowboys versus Indians. And so he did. He really marketed his weapon using many of these individuals who were fighting the Native Americans. That's how he initially sold many of those guns. And, it's a familiar story, this gun being marketed as a means to conquer the unfamiliar, to sort of fight on behalf of white Americans against Native Americans. Is a story that, has been recycled by the gun industry over and over again. Now, selling guns to white Americans to protect yourself against mobs of Black Americans that are coming into the suburbs for you. Colt, really pioneered that sort of fear narrative as a mechanism to convince people to buy firearms.
I don't know if you've had a chance to read Ryan Bussey's book, Gunfight, but he's a former Kimber exec, as you know. And he really chronicles the rise of the militarization of the industry as something that, happened in the aftermath of the expiration of the assault weapon ban, the Iraq War, the televised images that America saw of American troops in the Middle East, and how that really popularized assault weapons. And I think it's part of the answer to why we've seen so many more mass shootings in this country since Columbine in 1999. And you go after that question in the book of why are these shootings becoming deadlier? Why are they now more frequent? And I wonder, to what extent do you think the part of the answer rests in this reality that the firearms that Sam Colt first designed have now become just so much more powerful, and as a result, these tragedies are much more massive?
Yeah, listen, this is a short book, it's 300 pages, so I can only do so much. But
which I was thankful for, by the way.
But I think you do have to sort of start by admitting that America has always had a different relationship with firearms than other countries. It is true that the British were coming for our guns, and it was their attempt to try to take away citizens' firearms that set off the American Revolution. And that's not mythology, that's reality. And from the start, from the jump, there were just a lot more weapons in this country. There is this curious decision that we make after the invention of the handgun. When the handgun's invented, almost every other high-income nation looks at that thing and says, oh boy, we've got to regulate this thing, because now all of a sudden you can hide a deadly weapon in your pocket and a street argument can become a murder. The United States doesn't do that, and we're off. We're the only country, again, in the high-income world that is not regulating firearms. But something different happens, as you mentioned, in the 1990s. We had not necessarily fetishized guns in the way that we do now. Obviously, we had a lot of them. They were important to our culture, but all of a sudden there is a just sort of celebratory culture around firearms that's different, right? Especially around these very high-powered military-style weapons. I think it is caught up in the imagery that flows from some of those overseas wars, but it's also the video game culture in which a generation of kids uses these weapons in these video games and then wants to go out and try them out in real life. And it's also due to the changing nature of the gun industry. You have this rapid decline of the number of households that have guns, shotguns or pistols. And so all of a sudden, the gun industry realizes, oh boy, we're not going to be selling one gun to half of American households any longer. We're going to have a smaller segment of Americans that are buying guns. So let's sell the really expensive weapons, the assault weapons, at a higher volume, that just becomes the new model of the gun industry.
One of the questions you really grapple with in this book is the role that race plays in America's gun violence epidemic, and the way that racialized policies created conditions in which we see higher rates of gun violence, particularly in our urban communities. But it also, I would argue, helped fuel the rise of the modern NRA, which, of course, was really birthed by Harlan Carter, who, as you note in your book, had his own racialized past when at a young age he killed a young Mexican because he thought he had stolen the family car. And I just want to give you some space to say more about how race, created some of the, or solidified some of the root causes of gun violence, but also how it helped power the gun rights movement. And, I would argue continues to power it to this very day.
No, I think that's right. As I mentioned, the gun industry starts off selling weapons to protect Americans against Native Americans, and they just simply have shifted much of their marketing narrative to try to convince Americans that they have something to fear from people of color. This sort of image of these out of control Black Lives Matters mobs coming for you in the suburbs as a rationale to buy 3 or 4 more guns. It's central now to the narrative of the gun lobby. But I go back to this sort of moment, right? This moment in the 1800s when, up until the 1840s, 1850s, America was no more violent a place than anywhere else in Europe. And yet we still had a lot more guns in the United States at that point, but we weren't more violent. And there are these 3 things that happened. We talked about 2 of them. 1, the first big wave of immigration. 2, the invention of the handgun and our decision not to regulate it. But the other thing that's happening in the early to mid 1800s is the huge expansion of the slave population. And with the invention of the cotton gin, we have this massive increase in the number of enslaved Americans, African Americans in the South. And what comes with that is this massive increase in violence, right? Because the only way that you keep that number of Americans enslaved is through just the ritualized use of minute by minute, hour by hour violence. And the whole country becomes kind of anesthetized to violence because it's just how we order our economy. It's how we cheated and leapfrogged the rest of the world with respect to economic prominence by using just epidemic levels of violence on our labor force. And you see during this time, levels of violence between everybody goes up. White on white violence starts to go up at this time because it's just acceptable as a means of ordering society. But it never ended. We decided as a white race that we were, frankly, not comfortable giving up our position of prominence. And so while slavery went away with the Civil War, that violence just shifted to lynchings and Jim Crow, to sort of an informal but formalized level of violence. And then when that became unacceptable in the mid 1900s, it moved to imprisonment, which is just a different form of violence, locking somebody up in a steel cage and not letting them out. So violence has just always been there as a way for white people to make sure that, in particular, Black people, but to an extent, other people of color aren't able to challenge the dominant class.
You write in the book about the 1967 Kerner Commission, which sought to really answer the question of what is at the root of all of the violence that we're seeing. And it identified discriminatory housing policies and economic policies. And you tell the story of how Lyndon Johnson ran away, literally, to avoid that commission. And you ask a provocative question about what has really changed since 1967. Do you believe we've made progress?
Well, we've made progress, but certainly not enough. And there's arguments that in some areas we've gone backwards. We are a more racially and economically segregated country today than we were 20 years ago. In fact, every year we become more racially segregated as a nation. You are less likely today in my state of Connecticut, if you're a white kid, to go to school with Black students than you were when I was in school in the 1990s. And so we have continued to sort of pull away from each other as a nation, which is why we hit these moments like in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, when we just have trouble speaking to each other, right? Because white people can't understand the experience of George Floyd. And frankly, Black people can't understand the experience of white people often, because we're not living together any longer. So, of course we've made progress, but there are other areas, in particular, the integration of living patterns in which we've gotten worse. And, as I say in the book, we just have to understand that some of the reasons we live apart from each other are systems of separation that are unquestionably rooted in racism, right? The entire reason we have zoning laws in this country, if you look at the original zoning laws in this country are not about which size houses or how big your lots are. The original zoning laws are literally Black zones and white zones, right? That's the first zoning laws. They didn't disguise it. They literally were like, here's where the Black people live in Baltimore, where they started. Here's where the white people live. And zoning laws sort of changed over time to be based on factors other than race, but that's where it comes from. And so you just have to sort of understand the legacy of these rules that increasingly separate us from each other.
I appreciate that in the book you have very judicious use of statistics. I think sometimes we really throw them around in ways that aren't particularly persuasive. And I was struck by one that I hadn't seen before, that if you have a gun in the home, you are that gun is 6 times more likely to be used in some kind of horrible way. But of course, in my experience, I think partly you share this experience, that's very impersuasive when you try to argue to someone why they should be really thoughtful before they purchase a gun. And over these last couple of years in the aftermath and during the pandemic, we of course saw huge increases in gun sales. Many of those increases in Black and brown communities, right? Not the traditional base of gun consumers. And one of the questions I get asked so much, and I don't have a great answer, which is why I thought I'd ask you, is how would you dissuade someone from purchasing a gun, or how would you convince them that that's a decision that they really have to be thoughtful about, and not in this kind of knee-jerk way that we've seen over the last couple of years across the country?
Yeah, listen, I think that's a really important question. And, I do run into it, most prominently in a lot of these, lower income, predominantly African-American, Hispanic neighborhoods in which, I'll sit with a young person, who owns a gun or, have easy access to a gun, and they will say to me, listen, what's your plan for how I'm going to protect myself if you take away my gun? Everybody's got guns. You expect me to unilaterally disarm, right? And so it is a tough conversation, because without changing the sort of rules so that there is an overall decrease in the number of weapons, it is sometimes hard to convince an individual to give up that firearm, notwithstanding these statistics, which are just crystal clear. The idea of using a firearm to defend yourself against a bad guy or an attacker, it's like a shark attack, right? It doesn't happen to the level you think it does. In fact, as you mentioned, that gun is, depending on the statistics, 12 times more likely to kill you or accidentally kill your friend than it is to, kill an attacker. So I think we've got to do a better job of policies that just fundamentally decrease the number of weapons that exist in a place like the North End of Hartford in order for me to credibly walk into that community and tell individuals that they should stand down and, give their gun to a buyback program.
And talking about some of those policies, I also really appreciated the deep dive you did looking at America's foreign policy, how we export firearms across Latin America, something I've rarely seen in a book about guns and violence. And thank you for talking about the drone piece as well, which of course caused so much carnage and also, as you argue, really desensitized people from the act of killing. And I wanted to ask you about some of the core causes of gun violence. You spend time talking about, and you mentioned here, zoning laws, other economic factors, the inequity in education. So say more about this connection between poverty and violence. Oftentimes, violence is concentrated in areas of poverty.
Yeah. So what's interesting is if you dig into the FBI's big crime database, what you will find is that the correlation to violence is much closer when looking at poverty than it is race. It's close, but you are frankly just as likely to be the victim of violence if you're poor and white in this country as if you're poor and black. Now, it just so happens that there is a much higher percentage of black people and Hispanic people that are poor than white people. So when you look at it on a race-to-race basis, the exposure to violence in the black community is much higher than in the white community. And there is a long history of systemic racism that explains why you have more black people who are in economically challenged circumstances. But the truth of the matter is, there is always going to be a increased level of exposure to violence if you are less economically affluent. And there's this section in my book where I talk about spending some time in Baltimore, and this older guy who told me, whether I don't have any reason to believe it isn't true, but told me that he had been shot himself several times and survived as a young man in Baltimore. He says, "Sir, you ever been hungry?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I've been hungry." He's like, No. Have you ever been hungry? And now I sort of understand what he means, like, day after day hungry. And I say, no, I've never been that kind of hungry. He says, well, listen, you got to understand, hunger, it hardens your heart. And he goes on to explain how when you are that economically desperate that you literally don't have enough to eat every day, you do things that you might not otherwise do. You're desensitized to violence. You're less empathetic towards others because you're just trying to get by yourself. And so this exposure to violence, throughout human history does lead to an exposure to levels of violence. And in the United States, we just have this concentrated poverty in these neighborhoods. And so it's not like coincidence that the neighborhoods that have the elevated levels of violence just happen to be the neighborhoods where there's higher levels of poverty. Now you can say, but there are plenty of other parts of the world that don't have the levels of violence the United States does, but has the same poverty. Well, yeah, that's right. It's just we've chosen to layer on top of the intensive poverty guns so that you have easy access to a lethal means of violence, whereas in other parts of the world where poverty does lead to violence, it's a fist fight, or at worst, it might be a knife or a blunt instrument. In the United States, it's deadly because we have poverty and racism and guns all together in these relatively concentrated places.
I worked at the Center for American Progress for over a decade, working on a whole host of different issues that were not guns. And I remember prior to the Sandy Hook shooting, really after the Sandy Hook shooting, thinking to myself, now we can actually have a conversation about guns in America, a policy conversation, because in all my time working in progressive politics, the issue just never came up. I realized I knew nothing about it. There wasn't a team at CAP that was responsible for thinking about it. It was just nowhere to be found. And you in the book talk about how before that tragedy, you never really spent too much time thinking about the issue. And I think you have some deal of embarrassment about that, and you're not alone. If you talk to, and I know you have, Fred Guttenberg or Manny Oliver, they'll tell you the same thing, that they now feel embarrassed that they never really cared about this issue before. In those two instances, they lost their children. And so to me, that's a dynamic that continues to repeat itself, that it oftentimes feels, working on this issue, that unless you're directly impacted or live in a community with high rates of gun violence, you're basically like screaming into a void about it, right? It's almost like working on some kind of rare disease that only a few people have and no one else really knows about. And how do we change that dynamic? Because certainly we're still, and I take your point, and you say this a lot, and you write it in the book, that our movement is growing and has grown significantly since Sandy Hook. I agree with you completely on that. But the fundamental dynamic of gun rights enthusiasts, the small number of them, being so motivated that they have such a grip in our politics, and the overwhelming majority of Americans who may agree with us but aren't motivated in that same way, appears to be the central challenge that we face for making progress on the issue. How can we resolve that imbalance?
Yeah, listen, I mean, part of what I argue is that it's not as big an imbalance as people think it is, right? Right now, as we speak, we have a majority of members of the Senate and the House who are willing to pass very strong new gun laws. We have a president who's willing to sign that into law. The only thing that stops us from doing it today is the sort of draconian rules of the Senate that require you to have a supermajority. And of course, we still have the vast majority of Americans that support things like universal background checks. And I think that it is different now, especially in the sort of era of school shootings, because most families do not consider themselves immune from this, because you do have these active shooter drills happening in most schools across America. And, students today tragically almost feel like it's just a matter of time before their school. So you do have more people who feel personally invested in this than in the past. I talk a little bit about this in the book, but we just have this very strange phenomenon right now where one party can't break itself from the gun lobby. The Democratic Party used to have lots of people in our party that had an allegiance to the NRA. We don't any longer, but the Republican Party does. And it's this strange phenomenon where, coincidental to the moment where the gun lobby should have been losing power because of the strengthening power of our movement, the Republican Party just stopped sort of having any ideas. They have no new ideas. They sort of are just a party that hates government. And so all of a sudden at that moment, the NRA endorsement, notwithstanding their decline in power, became even more important, because what translates your anti-government bona fides better than being allied with the group that stands for the armed insurrection of the people against the government, which is the NRA. So the NRA has been able to sort of keep this hold on the Republican Party. Well, they have sort of lost the fight publicly. The NRA is not a popular organization any longer. It was 20 years ago. They've lost the fight in the Democratic Party. They have minorities in the House, the Senate. They can't elect a president that supports their policies. But we've got to figure this problem out within the Republican Party, find them a way to sort of show off their anti-government beliefs without having to stick as close as they remain to the gun lobby and the NRA.
Let me ask you in closing, and you wrestle with this in the book, and I appreciated truly the sensitivity and care you took in describing what happened during the Sandy Hook shooting, and really leaving some of those details with the families and those in the community who are directly impacted. But talk a bit about how the Sandy Hook shooting really changed you as a person, as a lawmaker. You, of course, had just been elected to the Senate. when it happened. And given that it wasn't an issue you had focused on in the past, it really forced you, and you talked about the hours you spent with your staff just learning about the NRA and the different dynamics. And this has become your life's mission. And so I'd just love to hear more about kind of the personal journey it took you on.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you and I have both been deeply personally affected by this epidemic, and it's why both of us now devote our lives to this mission. For me, there is obviously something fundamentally life-changing about being in that space, right? To be at the firehouse, during the time where the parents were told these kids weren't coming back, recognizing that these parents were all my age, right? At the time, I had a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, so right around the age of these kids. And in the 10 years since, many of those families, those parents have become close friends. And so I feel like I, have this personal obligation to them to do better. But as I talk about in the book, in as much as that moment was life-changing, arguably just as important was something that happened to me a few weeks later. I was elected to the Senate, Sandy Hook happened, and then I got sworn in early January. And about a week after I was sworn in, I do my first visit to the north end of Hartford, which is very close to where I grew up, a neighborhood with high levels of gun violence. And I meet with members of the community. And they are furious, rightly so. They look at me and they're like, where have you been? You were in Congress for 6 years. You were in the state legislature for 8 years. You grew up a stone's throw from this neighborhood. Where the hell have you been? What have you been doing? Why are you showing up now after 20 white kids got killed in Sandy Hook? And they said, listen, we grieve harder than anybody for the kids in Sandy Hook because we know what they're going through, because we've lost our sons and daughters, but we've been losing our sons and daughters for 20 years. So get to work. And it's the people I met in that room, Sam Saylor and Hank Brown, and Deborah Davis and Henrietta Beckman, that are just as close to me now as those families in Newtown. And that in many ways was like the wake-up call for me, was like, why haven't I realized what was happening here, regardless of whether there had been a school shooting in my state? So what I think we have done and need to do better is bringing these constituencies together. It still pains me that this country, pays attention to the issue of guns in America normally only after a suburban school shooting, and after a weekend in which 20 Black young men and women get shot in New Orleans or Chicago. There's not a single story on the news. We've got to fix that. And that's, of course, rooted in this sort of systemic racism in which we value white life differently than Black life. But my life was changed by being there, by becoming close to those families, but then also having that experience in the north end of Hartford. It's at the beginning of my book, I purposefully start the book not by talking about Sandy Hook, by talking about a murder of a young 20-year-old man in Hartford a couple of weeks before Sandy Hook. And I don't think it's coincidental that I now live 2 blocks from the place where he was shot. So I now live in Hartford. I drive by the intersection where this young man, Shane Oliver, was shot every day that I'm in Connecticut. And I think that is because I have become, very much psychologically connected with those families in Hartford as much as I am with the families in Newtown. You tell me, Igor. I mean, I believe that this is a matter of when, not if. I just think that our cause is one of these great social change causes that you read about in the history books. I know that it took, 14 years from Emmett Till's open casket until the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. I know how long it took to get marriage equality on the books. I know how impatient people are, and people can't understand how it's been 9 years since Sandy Hook and we haven't been able to change the laws. But I think great social change movements have to recognize a lot of defeat comes before victory, and you just have to be so confident in the righteousness of your cause that you don't give up. And that's my attitude.
Senator Murphy, thank you so much for this conversation, for writing this book, for your continued work in leading this movement. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for all your friendship and your partnership, and for inviting me to be part of this. Look forward to lots of victories together.
Thank you, Senator.